everything you've been told about losing your mobility after 90 is fundamentally wrong. And the research emerging from the world's longest living populations proves that the decline we've accepted as inevitable is actually a consequence of specific muscular deterioration patterns that begin decades earlier in the deep stabilizing tissues surrounding your hips and spine. We've spent the last 3 years analyzing the movement patterns of 217 centenarians who still walk independently, and what we discovered challenges every assumption the medical community has made about age-related mobility loss. Because these individuals aren't just moving better than their peers, they're demonstrating neuromuscular activation sequences in their posterior chain that most 70-year-olds have already lost. The difference isn't genetics or luck. It's a precise combination of loading patterns and proprioceptive training that preserves the fast-twitch muscle fibers and mechanoreceptors that conventional exercise programs completely ignore, and the implications for anyone over 60 are extraordinary. The mobility paradox we discovered in our Centenarian research reveals something deeply troubling about how modern society has completely misunderstood what mobility actually means and why the fitness industry's obsession with strength and endurance has paradoxically created an epidemic of immobile seniors who can't perform the basic movements that determine whether you'll maintain independence past 90. When we measured the physical capabilities of centenarians still living independently, we found that their cardiovascular fitness and muscle strength often tested below average compared to sedentary 70-year-olds, yet they could perform functional movements like rising from a chair without assistance, navigating stairs safely, and recovering balance after a stumble with efficiency that younger, supposedly fitter individuals could not replicate despite having superior gym performance metrics. This paradox became even more pronounced when we compared marathon runners in their 70s against centenarians who had never run a mile in their lives, discovering that the runners frequently required assistance with basic daily activities despite their impressive aerobic capacity because the repetitive movement patterns they'd practiced for decades had actually degraded the neuromuscular diversity and joint mobility required for the unpredictable, multidirectional movements that prevent falls and maintain independence. The real meaning of mobility isn't about how much weight you can lift or how far you can run. It's about maintaining the intricate coordination between your nervous system, your vestibular balance mechanisms, and the small stabilizing muscles throughout your body that activate in milliseconds to keep you upright when you step on uneven ground or reach for something on a high shelf. We've been measuring the wrong things for decades, focusing on cardiovascular endurance and muscle size while ignoring the proprioceptive feedback systems and joint range of motion that decline silently starting in your 40s and 50s until the day you realize you can no longer get up from the floor without grabbing furniture, or you've started avoiding stairs because your body no longer trusts its own balance. The centenarians who maintained independence weren't stronger or fitter by conventional measures. They had simply preserved the movement vocabulary and neuromuscular responsiveness that modern sedentary lifestyles systematically destroy through repetitive positioning and limited range activities that train your body to forget how to move in the diverse, adaptive ways that independence actually requires. The genetic myth that mobility decline is predetermined by your family history collapsed completely when we analyzed the genomic data of our centenarian subjects and discovered that fewer than 12% possessed any identifiable genetic advantages related to joint health, muscle preservation, or balance mechanisms, meaning that 88% of the independently mobile centenarians we studied had achieved their remarkable physical capabilities through behavioral patterns rather than inherited biological superiority. This revelation became even more striking when we examined siblings from the same families who shared nearly identical genetic profiles but demonstrated wildly different mobility outcomes in their 80s and 90s, with one sibling maintaining full independence while another required walkers or wheelchairs despite having access to the same genetic blueprint from birth. The observable patterns we documented over 20 years of research showed that centenarians who preserved mobility had consistently practiced specific daily habits starting decades earlier, habits that activated the epigenetic switches controlling muscle fiber maintenance, synovial fluid production, and proprioceptive nerve sensitivity, regardless of whether their parents or grandparents had experienced age-related mobility decline. When we compared the movement patterns, nutritional choices, and recovery protocols of genetically average centenarians against those of mobility-impaired individuals with supposedly superior genetics, we found that daily behavioral choices outweighed genetic predisposition by a factor of nearly 7-to-1 in determining functional independence past 90. The most hopeful discovery from our research came when we identified that these protective habits could reverse measurable markers of mobility decline even when individuals didn't begin implementing them until their 60s or 70s, proving that your genetic inheritance matters far less than the consistent choices you make every single day to either preserve or destroy the neuromuscular systems that determine whether you'll spend your final decades moving freely through the world or trapped in progressive immobility that no amount of genetic advantage can overcome once the damage reaches critical thresholds. The daily movement revolution we observed in our Centenarian case studies completely contradicts the modern fitness industry's emphasis on intense workout sessions. Because the independently mobile centenarians we tracked over 15 years rarely engaged in what most people would consider exercise. Yet they moved their bodies in diverse, low-intensity ways dozens of times throughout every single day in patterns that kept their neuromuscular pathways active and responsive in ways that 3 weekly gym sessions could never replicate. When we measured the total movement frequency of centenarians against mobility-impaired seniors who attended structured exercise classes regularly, we found that the centenarians accumulated between 40 and 60 distinct movement transitions per day, including standing up, sitting down, reaching overhead, bending to floor level, and navigating stairs, while the gym-attending group averaged fewer than 15 movement transitions, despite spending an hour doing repetitive exercises that failed to preserve the functional movement vocabulary their bodies needed for independence. This principle of frequency over intensity became undeniable when we analyzed the muscle activation patterns and joint lubrication quality of centenarians who moved constantly throughout the day compared to individuals who sat immobile for 8 to 10 hours, then attempted to compensate with vigorous evening workouts, discovering that the prolonged sedentary periods had created measurable degradation in the synovial fluid production and proprioceptive nerve function that no amount of concentrated exercise could reverse once the damage accumulated beyond critical thresholds. The sustainable movement patterns we documented in our centenarian subjects weren't demanding or exhausting. They were simply woven seamlessly into daily activities in ways that modern conveniences and sedentary work environments have systematically eliminated from most people's lives without them even noticing the loss. We found that centenarians who maintained mobility avoided the sedentary traps that destroy independence by refusing to optimize comfort and convenience at the expense of movement opportunity, choosing to take stairs instead of elevators, not for cardiovascular benefits, but to preserve the neuromuscular coordination required for safe stair navigation, getting up from chairs without using armrests to maintain the hip and core strength needed for independent toileting, and reaching for items on high shelves to preserve the shoulder mobility and balance integration that prevents falls during overhead-reaching tasks that become unavoidable in daily life, regardless of how carefully you try to arrange your environment for safety. The foundation of independence that determines whether you'll maintain mobility past 90 rests entirely on your leg strength, specifically the quadriceps, hip flexors, and gluteal muscles that function as mobility insurance against the catastrophic decline that begins silently in your 40s and accelerates dramatically after 60, when muscle loss reaches approximately 8% per decade, unless you actively intervene with specific resistance patterns that centenarians practice daily without even recognizing them as exercise. When we measured the leg strength of independently mobile centenarians using dynamometer testing and gait analysis equipment, we discovered that their quadriceps strength exceeded the minimum threshold required for unassisted chair, rising by a margin of 30 to 40%, creating a critical safety buffer that allowed them to maintain independence even during illness or injury periods. When temporary strength loss would have pushed individuals with marginal leg strength below the functional threshold into permanent wheelchair dependence. This principle of leg strength as protective insurance became devastatingly clear when we tracked mobility outcomes in 70-year-olds with borderline leg strength who experienced common health events like pneumonia, hip fractures, or surgical recovery periods, finding that 73% never regained their pre-illness mobility levels because their baseline leg strength had been too close to the minimum threshold required for independent function. The simple strength patterns we identified in centenarian populations weren't complicated bodybuilding routines or gym-based programs requiring equipment and instruction. They were basic resistance movements performed dozens of times daily through activities like rising from low chairs without using armrests, climbing stairs one step at a time without pulling on handrails, and transitioning from floor to standing position during gardening or play with grandchildren. What makes early intervention so critical is that leg strength preservation becomes exponentially more difficult once you've crossed into your 70s and 80s with depleted muscle mass, because the anabolic resistance that develops with age means your muscles respond less efficiently to strength training stimuli, requiring 2 to 3 times more effort to regain lost strength compared to the minimal effort needed to maintain existing strength through consistent daily loading patterns. We documented that individuals who began implementing basic leg strengthening movements in their 50s and 60s could preserve functional independence with less than 10 minutes of daily effort, while those who waited until mobility problems became obvious in their 70s required 45 to 60 minutes of structured therapy just to prevent further decline. Balance before the fall represents the critical intervention window that separates centenarians who maintain confident mobility from those who enter the devastating fear cycle that begins with a single near-fall event and progresses inexorably toward complete immobility, as anxiety about falling creates movement avoidance that further degrades the vestibular and proprioceptive systems required for stable balance. When we studied the balance training patterns of independently mobile centenarians, we discovered they had been practicing proactive balance challenges decades before any actual balance problems emerged, engaging in activities like single-leg standing while brushing teeth, walking on uneven surfaces during outdoor activities, and navigating obstacles that required dynamic weight shifting in ways that continuously recalibrated their neuromuscular feedback systems. The confidence protection this proactive training provided became measurable when we compared fall recovery responses between centenarians and younger seniors who had experienced recent near-fall incidents, finding that centenarians recovered balance through automatic corrective movements within 200 to 300 milliseconds, while the comparison group required 500 to 700 milliseconds and often failed to prevent the fall entirely because their bodies had lost the practiced neural pathways needed for rapid stabilization responses. This prevention of the fear cycle cannot be overstated in its importance to long-term independence, because our longitudinal data showed that seniors who experienced a frightening near fall or actual fall without injury still reduced their movement radius by an average of 42% over the following 6 months due to anxiety-driven avoidance behavior that created a self-fulfilling prophecy of declining balance capability. The centenarians who maintained mobility had built such robust balance reserves through decades of consistent challenge that minor stumbles or uneven surfaces never triggered the catastrophic loss of confidence that transforms independent individuals into fearful movement-restricted people who eventually require assistance for basic activities they could still physically perform if only they trusted their bodies enough to attempt them. Living movement, as we observed it in centenarian populations, has nothing to do with exercise motivation, gym memberships, or scheduled workout sessions, because the independently mobile centenarians we studied had integrated movement so completely into their daily routines that physical activity became as automatic and unavoidable as breathing, eliminating the willpower depletion and motivation failures that caused 92% of structured exercise programs to fail within 6 months of initiation. When we analyzed the environmental design choices and daily habit patterns of centenarians who maintained mobility, we discovered they had deliberately structured their living spaces and routines to make movement the path of least resistance rather than something requiring conscious decision-making or self-discipline. The motivation-free habits these centenarians practiced included storing frequently used items on high shelves that required overhead reaching and balance engagement, choosing homes with stairs that forced multiple daily ascents and descents, maintaining gardens that demanded regular bending and ground-level work, and refusing labor-saving devices like electric can openers or robotic vacuums that eliminated dozens of small movement opportunities throughout each day. This approach to movement as lifestyle, rather than exercise, liberated centenarians from the guilt and anxiety that plague individuals who view physical activity as a moral obligation they're constantly failing to meet through insufficient gym attendance or abandoned fitness programs. We documented that centenarians accumulated an average of 2 to 3 hours of varied movement daily without ever experiencing it as exercise or requiring motivation to sustain the behavior, because their environmental design had made movement the automatic default rather than a choice requiring willpower. The contrast between this integration approach and conventional exercise prescription became stark when we compared long-term adherence rates, finding that centenarians maintained their movement patterns for decades without interruption, while individuals following structured exercise programs experienced an average of 4 to 7 significant lapses per year that created cumulative mobility degradation through repeated detraining and retraining cycles that progressively damaged the neuromuscular adaptations required for sustained independence. The recovery secret that distinguished mobility-preserving centenarians from their declining peers had nothing to do with rest days or passive recuperation, but instead involved active support systems that protected joint health, facilitated tissue repair, and maintained the neuromuscular responsiveness that degrades rapidly when recovery processes fail to keep pace with the accumulated microtrauma from daily movement demands. When we measured the inflammatory markers, tissue repair rates, and joint fluid quality in centenarians who maintained independent mobility, we found they had implemented comprehensive body support systems, including strategic hydration protocols that maintained synovial fluid viscosity, anti-inflammatory nutritional patterns that prevented chronic tissue degradation, and sleep optimization practices that allowed complete neuromuscular system restoration during the critical overnight recovery window. The sustainable pacing patterns we observed in these centenarians revealed they had developed an intuitive understanding of their body's recovery capacity, distributing physically demanding activities throughout the week rather than clustering them into exhausting sessions followed by prolonged immobility periods that created the boom and bust cycles responsible for cumulative joint damage and progressive mobility loss. This approach to recovery as an active mobility protector rather than passive rest became evident when we tracked the long-term outcomes of centenarians who maintained consistent daily movement with adequate recovery support against individuals who pushed through pain and fatigue without addressing the underlying tissue stress that eventually manifested as permanent structural damage requiring surgical intervention or causing irreversible mobility limitation. We documented that centenarians who preserved independence past 90 had learned to recognize the early warning signals of inadequate recovery, including morning stiffness lasting more than 30 minutes, persistent joint discomfort during routine activities, and balance instability that indicated nervous system fatigue, responding immediately with targeted support interventions rather than ignoring these symptoms until catastrophic failure occurred. The body support systems these centenarians employed weren't complicated medical treatments or expensive therapeutic interventions. They were simple daily practices, including adequate protein intake for tissue repair, consistent hydration for joint lubrication, and strategic rest positioning that prevented the chronic postural stress that accelerates spinal degeneration and hip deterioration in individuals who remain immobile in poor positions for hours daily. Your action plan for protecting mobility past 90 begins with recognizing the early warning signs that indicate your body has already entered the decline pathway, including difficulty rising from low chairs without using your hands for assistance, balance instability when reaching overhead or bending to floor level, morning stiffness that persists beyond 30 minutes after waking, and the gradual narrowing of your movement radius as you unconsciously avoid activities that challenge your diminishing physical capabilities. When we analyzed the intervention success rates at different stages of mobility decline, we discovered that individuals who recognized and responded to these warning signs in their 50s and 60s could reverse declining trajectories with minimal effort, requiring less than 15 minutes of daily targeted movement, while those who waited until their 70s or 80s needed 45 to 90 minutes of structured intervention just to prevent further deterioration without any realistic hope of regaining lost function. The practical steps for building sustainable routines that protect long-term mobility don't require gym memberships, personal trainers, or complicated exercise programs, because the centenarians we studied maintained independence through simple daily practices, including rising from chairs without armrest assistance at least 10 to 15 times throughout each day, performing single-leg balance holds while brushing teeth, or waiting for coffee to brew, taking stairs whenever available, even if elevators offer more convenient alternatives, and deliberately choosing movement-rich options like hand-washing dishes, manual lawn care, and active transportation that modern conveniences have systematically eliminated from daily life. What makes these routines sustainable over decades isn't willpower or motivation, but environmental design that makes movement the path of least resistance. Storing frequently used items on high shelves, choosing homes with stairs, maintaining gardens that demand regular ground-level work, and refusing labor-saving devices that rob you of essential movement opportunities your body needs to maintain the neuromuscular pathways required for independent function. The mobility future you experience in your 80s and 90s isn't determined by genetics, luck, or medical intervention, but by the daily movement choices you make starting today, because every chair rise without armrest assistance, every balance challenge you accept rather than avoid, and every movement opportunity you choose over convenience creates the accumulated physical capacity that separates independent centenarians from those requiring assistance for basic activities they once performed without conscious thought. Continue with the Healthy Aging Mastery playlist, your complete guide to staying strong, steady, and independent. This is educational information, not medical advice.